kicked out at 18 with nowhere to go, he suddenly inherited a broken pottery shop, and what he discovered inside changed his life forever. Hello everyone! Before we begin, make sure to join our YouTube family by subscribing to the channel. Don't forget to like this video, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. Alright, now let's dive into the story. The night I turned 18, I lost everything. There was no shouting, no dramatic fight, no slammed doors that neighbors could gossip about later. It happened quietly, almost politely, which somehow made it worse. My stepfather stood near the entrance with his arms crossed, avoiding my eyes as if I were already a stranger. "You're an adult now," he said flatly. "Time to figure your life out." A worn backpack landed at my feet. I recognized it instantly, the one I used in middle school. Inside were a few folded clothes, an old hoodie, and some notebooks. Nothing else. No money, no food, no explanation. I looked toward my mother, waiting for her to say something, anything. She sat at the kitchen table, staring into a mug of tea that had long gone cold. Her silence felt heavier than his words. "Mom?" I asked quietly. She didn't look up. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't temporary. I wasn't being punished. I was being erased. I picked up the backpack slowly and stepped outside. The door closed behind me with a soft click. Not angry, not loud, just final. Cold air greeted me like reality itself. The streetlights flickered on as evening settled over the neighborhood I had grown up in. Houses glowed warmly from inside. Families eating dinner, televisions humming, lives continuing as normal. Mine had suddenly stopped. I walked without direction until my legs hurt. Pride kept me from knocking on friends' doors. What would I even say? That I had nowhere to sleep. That first night, I sat at a bus stop bench, hugging my backpack. Cars passed in streaks of light. People glanced at me briefly before looking away. Around midnight, exhaustion won, and I lay down across the cold metal bench. Sleep came in fragments. Every sound woke me: footsteps, engines, distant laughter. The world felt louder when you didn't belong anywhere in it. Morning arrived too quickly. Hunger followed soon after. The next few days blurred together. I learned things no school ever taught me. Which convenience stores allowed you to refill water bottles without buying anything. Which restaurants threw away untouched food at closing time. Which public bathrooms stayed unlocked overnight. Each lesson chipped away at who I used to be. By the fourth day, my reflection in a shop window startled me. My hair was messy, eyes tired, clothes wrinkled. I looked invisible, like someone people passed every day without noticing. On the seventh day, everything changed. I was sitting behind a grocery store, sorting through a plastic bag of discarded bread when someone called my name, Daniel Hale. I looked up, confused. A postal worker stood nearby, holding an envelope, scanning me uncertainly. "Yeah," I said slowly. He hesitated before handing it over. "Been trying to deliver this for days." The envelope was thick, yellowed with age. Sealed with dark red wax, stamped by an unfamiliar symbol, my name was written in careful handwriting. I turned it over, unsure why. My hands were shaking. Inside were legal documents. At first, the words didn't make sense. I reread the same sentence 5 times before understanding settled in. "You have been named the sole inheritor of Hale Pottery." My breath caught. Hale was my last name, but I didn't know anyone who owned a pottery shop. My family rarely spoke about relatives beyond immediate holidays. Then I saw the signature. Arthur Hale. My grandfather, a man I barely remembered, a quiet figure from childhood visits, always covered in clay dust, always smiling gently while adults avoided conversations about him. The letter explained he had passed away 2 weeks earlier. The business and property were now legally mine. An address was listed across town. I almost laughed. The idea felt unreal. I was homeless, hungry, and suddenly someone claimed I owned a shop. Still, it was an address, and an address meant possibility. I walked there the next morning. The journey took nearly 2 hours on foot. As the city changed from crowded streets to older districts, buildings grew quieter, older, forgotten by modernization. Finally, I found it, Hale Pottery. The sign hung crooked above a narrow storefront, squeezed between newer businesses. The paint had faded so badly the letters barely showed. One window was cracked, covered partially with cardboard. Dust coated the glass, thick enough to block the interior completely. The building looked abandoned. Shattered clay pieces littered the entrance like broken shells. "This can't be right," I whispered. An elderly woman sweeping the sidewalk next door glanced at me. "You hear about Arthur?" she asked. "I think he was my grandfather." Her expression softened instantly. "He talked about you, said someday family would come back." A strange weight settled in my chest. The lawyer arrived shortly after carrying a briefcase and a tired smile. He unlocked the chained door and pushed it open. Dust exploded into sunlight. The smell hit first: clay, ash, and years of neglect. Inside was devastation. Shelves leaned at dangerous angles. Hundreds of pottery pieces lay shattered across the floor. Bowls split cleanly in half, vases crushed into fragments. A pottery wheel sat frozen in the corner, coated in gray dust. It looked less like a shop and more like a memory left behind. "There were financial struggles," the lawyer explained gently. "Your grandfather refused to sell, despite offers." Offers. I stepped carefully through the debris, shoes crunching against broken clay. The walls caught my attention immediately. They were covered with sketches, intricate patterns drawn repeatedly, almost obsessively. Circles intersecting lines, symbols layered over shapes that resembled maps or constellations. It didn't look random. It looked intentional. "He left this for you," the lawyer said, handing me a small iron key. I turned it in my palm, confused. "What does it open?" He shrugged. "He said you would know when the time came." After signing papers, the lawyer left and silence returned. I stood alone inside the ruined shop. Sunlight streamed through dusty windows, illuminating floating particles like tiny stars. For a long moment, I considered walking away, selling the place, taking whatever money I could get, but something stopped me. Maybe it was pride, maybe curiosity, maybe the simple fact that this broken building was the first thing in days that belonged to me. I found an old broom leaning against a wall. The handle was cracked, bristles uneven. Still, I picked it up. The first sweep pushed aside dust that hadn't moved in years. Each motion revealed pieces hidden underneath, fragments of bowls painted with care, sculptures shaped by patient hands. Even broken, they felt meaningful. Hours passed without me noticing. By evening, one small section of the floor was clean. I sat down, exhausted, surrounded by silence and clay shards glowing orange under sunset light. For the first time since being thrown out, I didn't feel completely lost. I didn't know how to run a business. I didn't understand pottery. I barely understood my own family, but standing there, in a shattered shop, left to someone with nothing else in the world, I felt something unfamiliar growing inside me. Not hope, not yet, but purpose. And for the first time since becoming homeless, tomorrow didn't feel empty. The second week inside the pottery shop began with aching muscles and hands that no longer looked like my own. Fine cuts covered my fingers from handling broken clay, and dust clung permanently beneath my nails no matter how often I washed them in the cracked sink behind the counter. But the shop was changing. Slowly, piece by piece, it began to breathe again. Sunlight now reached parts of the floor that had been buried under debris for years. I cleared pathways between shelves, stacked salvageable pottery carefully, and swept away mountains of shattered fragments. Every evening, I collapsed onto an old couch I had dragged from the storage room, too tired to think, but strangely satisfied. Cleaning gave structure to my days. Hunger still followed me, but now I had somewhere to return to at night. That alone felt like wealth. The more I worked, the more I noticed something unusual about the pottery itself. None of it looked ordinary. At first glance, the pieces appeared simple: bowls, cups, vases, but closer inspection revealed intricate carvings hidden along rims and bases. Patterns repeated across different items with almost mathematical precision. Lines intersected circles at exact angles. Some markings were so subtle they could only be seen when light struck them sideways. One afternoon, while wiping dust from a tall vase, I turned it upside down and froze. A symbol marked the bottom, a circle divided by 3 straight lines. I had seen it before on the shop walls, scratched into wooden tables, even carved faintly into the pottery wheel itself. Curious, I checked another piece, the same symbol, and another. Again, nearly every intact item carried it. It wasn't a signature in the normal sense. There was no name, no initials. Just the symbol, repeated endlessly, as if it mattered more than the pottery itself. That night, curiosity refused to let me sleep. Using a flashlight, I examined the walls more closely. Beneath layers of dust, hundreds of sketches filled the surface. Some showed pottery shapes, but others resembled diagrams, arrows pointing to curves, measurements written beside designs, symbols arranged in sequences like coded language. My grandfather hadn't just been making art, he had been documenting something. While cleaning behind the counter the next morning, my broom struck wood with a hollow sound. I paused. The panel behind the register looked slightly uneven. I pressed against it. Nothing. I pushed harder. With a soft click, the wooden board shifted inward. My heart sped up. Carefully, I slid the panel aside, revealing a hidden compartment built into the wall. Inside rested a small leather notebook wrapped in faded cloth. Dust puffed into the air as I lifted it out. The leather felt worn, but cared for, edges softened by years of handling. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. The first page held a single sentence. "If you are reading this, then you are the one I waited for." Hard. The handwriting was shaky yet deliberate. My grandfather's. The pages described our family history, stretching back generations. According to him, pottery wasn't merely a trade passed down through the Hale family. It was a responsibility. He wrote about clay holding memory, about shapes preserving meaning long after words faded. Ancient artisans, he claimed, used patterns to store stories and messages in plain sight. At first, it sounded poetic, symbolic. Then the entries grew more serious. He described visitors who came asking to purchase specific designs, not the shop itself, just certain pieces. They offered large sums of money. When he refused, they returned repeatedly, growing more insistent each time. They do not want art, one entry read. They want what the patterns contain. A chill crawled along my spine. I flipped pages faster. My grandfather believed the designs encoded information, passed secretly through generations. Messages hidden within geometry, readable only by those who understood the system. The final entries were rushed, ink darker, as if written under stress. They know something is here. I will not let it leave this family. If anything happens to me, the truth rests beneath the kill. I stared at the sentence for a long time. Beneath the kill? My eyes slowly lifted toward the back of the shop, where the massive old kill stood silent against the wall. Its metal surface rusted but imposing. Before I could think further, a shadow moved outside the window. Voices followed, low, professional. I quickly closed the notebook and slipped it into my backpack. A knock echoed against the door. I hesitated before opening it halfway. Two men in dark suits stood outside. Their appearance felt out of place in the aging street. Clean shoes, perfect posture, confident smiles that looked practiced rather than friendly. "Good afternoon," the taller one said smoothly. "We represent a development group interested in this property." "I'm not selling," I replied instinctively. His smile didn't fade. "You may wish to hear the offer first. This building requires extensive repairs. Maintaining it alone could become difficult." The way he said difficult sounded less like concern and more like certainty. I said no. The second man handed me a business card anyway. "We'll give you time to reconsider." As they turned to leave, the taller man paused and glanced down, not at the storefront, but directly toward the floor inside, as if measuring distance. My stomach tightened. They knew something. After they drove away, the shop felt different. Smaller, watched. I locked the door and checked every window twice. That night I reread the notebook slowly, searching for details I might have missed. The patterns described weren't random decorations, but structured. Systems curves representing locations. Lines marking timelines, spacing indicating relationships between events. It was a language made of clay, ... near the back. Pages. My grandfather wrote about discovering something hidden beneath the shop decades earlier, something intentionally buried by the original founder of Hale Pottery. He never described it fully. Only one repeated warning. Some truths survive only if protected. Outside, a car slowed near the shop before driving on. Sleep didn't come easily. Every sound felt amplified. Creaking wood, wind brushing against broken windows, distant footsteps echoing through empty streets. Around midnight, I walked to the kill and placed my hand against its cold metal surface. Beneath it lay whatever secret my grandfather had guarded his entire life. And judging by the visitors earlier that day, I wasn't the only one searching for it. For the first time since inheriting the shop, fear mixed with curiosity. But stronger than both was determination. I had spent days feeling unwanted, disposable, invisible. Now something, or someone, believed I possessed something valuable enough to pursue. I wasn't running anymore. I stared at the kill in silence, already knowing what I would do next. Tomorrow, I would move it, and whatever waited underneath would finally come into the light. Moving the kiln turned out to be harder than anything I had attempted in my life. For decades it had sat in the same spot, bolted into the concrete floor, as if someone had wanted to make sure it never moved again. The metal body was thick and heavy, its surface scarred by years of heat and use. Rust clung to the bolts like stubborn memories. I spent the morning studying it, circling slowly, trying to understand how it had been installed. My grandfather must have placed it there intentionally. The notebook's final line echoed in my mind again and again. The truth rests beneath the kill. I found tools scattered in a cabinet, old wrenches, a pry bar, a hammer whose wooden handle had darkened from decades of use. None of it looked new, but it would have to do. The first bolt took nearly 20 minutes to loosen. My hands slipped constantly, and sweat ran into my eyes. Each movement made the kill creak faintly, like something waking from a long sleep. By noon, my arms felt like stone. But slowly, stubbornly, the bolts began to give way, one by one. When the final bolt rolled across the floor with a metallic clink, I stepped back and stared at the kill. Even without the bolts, it didn't move easily. It must have weighed hundreds of pounds. I wedged the pry bar underneath and pushed with everything I had. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a deep scraping sound that echoed through the shop, the kiln shifted slightly. Dust exploded upward from beneath it. My heart began to pound. I pushed again, muscles shaking, legs braced against the floor. The kiln scraped across the concrete, inch by inch, leaving a faint line where it had stood for decades. When it finally moved far enough, I froze. A metal hatch was embedded in the floor. It was small, just large enough for a person to climb through, but its edges were perfectly fitted into the concrete, as if it had been installed when the building itself was first constructed. In the center sat a heavy lock. My hand slowly reached into my pocket and pulled out the iron key the lawyer had given me. For a moment, I just stared at it. My grandfather had known exactly what he was leaving behind. I knelt beside the hatch and inserted the key. The metal scraped slightly as it turned, the mechanism resisting before finally giving way with a deep click. The sound echoed through the empty shop. I lifted the hatch carefully. Cool air rushed out, carrying a smell of earth and old clay. A narrow staircase disappeared into darkness below. I grabbed a flashlight from the counter and aimed the beam downward. Stone steps, a hidden room. My pulse hammered as I descended slowly, each step creaking under my weight. The air grew cooler as I moved deeper, the silence thick and undisturbed. When my feet touched the ground, the flashlight revealed a small underground chamber. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and on those shelves stood pottery. Not broken pieces like upstairs, perfect ones. Dozens of bowls, jars, and vases sat neatly arranged, each coated with a thin layer of dust. Their surfaces carried the same symbol I had seen everywhere in the shop, a circle divided by 3 lines. But these pieces were different. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. The curves were precise, the patterns incredibly detailed, as if they had been created with impossible patience. In the center of the room stood a wooden chest. I approached it slowly, almost afraid to disturb the silence. Inside the chest were stacks of documents tied together with string, old photographs, letters written in fading ink, maps folded carefully. I opened the first bundle. The letter inside was dated nearly 70 years ago. As I read, the story unfolded, piece by piece. My family had not simply made pottery, they had protected secrets. During times of war and political chaos decades earlier, people needed ways to hide information safely. Paper could burn, books could be confiscated, but pottery's simple household objects passed unnoticed. My ancestors had developed a system. Patterns carved into clay acted as coded records. Certain curves represented locations. Lines indicated dates. Tiny markings hidden along rims identified people connected to those events. Entire histories had been preserved inside everyday objects. Refugees, historians, and even journalists had trusted the Hale family to protect records that powerful people wanted erased. Evidence of stolen land, names of missing individuals, documents exposing crimes committed by wealthy families and corporations. The pottery upstairs wasn't just art, it was an archive. My grandfather had been the final guardian. I continued reading until one name began appearing again and again. The development company that had visited the shop. But decades earlier, they had operated under a different name. Their founders were among the businessmen accused in several of the hidden records. They had tried to buy the shop multiple times over the years, hoping to recover and destroy the encoded pottery before the truth could surface. My grandfather had refused every offer. A final letter rested at the bottom of the chest. It was addressed to me. Daniel, if you are reading this, then you found the room. I hoped you would. Our family protected these records because history deserves witnesses. Many people trusted us with their stories when the world tried to silence them. I am old now, and I knew I would not live forever. But secrets like these must never vanish. One day, someone brave enough would have to bring them into the light. Perhaps that someone is you. I sat there for a long time, the letter shaking slightly in my hands. Above me, the old shop creaked softly as wind brushed against its walls. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed from the front door. I froze. Another knock followed harder this time. Voices drifted through the floorboards. "They're in there," someone said, ... My chest tightened. Instantly, the men had come back. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to breathe slowly. I gathered the most important documents into my backpack, the letters, the maps, the photographs. Sand closed the chest. When I climbed the stairs and pushed the hatch shut, the pounding on the door had grown louder. "Open the door," a voice called sharply. I slid the kill back over the hatch just enough to hide it again. The door rattled violently. "This is your last chance to talk," the man shouted. Instead of answering, I pulled out my phone and dialed a number written inside the notebook. One my grandfather had labeled simply, "If anything happens, call him." The historian who answered listened quietly as I explained everything. Within 2 days, the quiet pottery shop became the center of national attention. Experts arrived, first historians, archivists, journalists. Authorities followed soon after once the documents revealed decades of hidden corruption. Tied to powerful families, the development company disappeared almost overnight. Investigations began. For the first time in years, people filled the shop again not to buy property, but to learn the truth stored inside its walls. Months passed. The broken shelves were repaired, windows replaced, the sign above the door repainted carefully. Holly Pottery reopened, not just as a shop, but as a place where history and art lived together. Tourists visited. Students studied the encoded patterns. New pottery lined the shelves beside the preserved originals. One evening, as golden sunset light poured through the windows, I sat at the pottery wheel for the first time. Clay spun beneath my fingers. The motion felt awkward at first. Then, slowly, naturally, the shape began to form, a simple bowl. My hands were covered in clay, my clothes dusty. The shop filled with warm light and quiet. Conversation from visitors exploring the displays, and I realized something. The night I turned 18, I believed I had lost everything. But standing there now, shaping clay inside the shop, my grandfather protected his entire life. I understood the truth. I hadn't inherited a broken building. I had inherited a purpose. And sometimes the greatest secrets in the world are hidden inside the simplest things, waiting patiently for someone brave enough to uncover them